A magnitude 5.6 just hit right where the northern end of the Cascadia Subduction Zone meets some of the most complicated, most heavily studied fault geometry on the entire west coast of North America. And the question landing in my inbox right now is the same question landing in yours. Is this a foreshock to the big one? Let's answer that properly, because this isn't a place to guess. This is the most consequential fault system in North America, and getting the interpretation wrong in either direction, dismissing it completely, or panicking without cause does nobody any favors. So let's go through exactly what's happening, exactly what we know, and exactly what we don't. First, the setup. Cascadia is not one single fault. It's an entire subduction zone stretching roughly 1,000 kilometers from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia. Along this boundary, the Juan de Fuca plate, a relatively small oceanic plate, is diving underneath the much larger North American plate. That sounds like a normal subduction setup, and in many ways it is, but Cascadia has one property that makes it uniquely dangerous compared to almost anywhere else on Earth. For most of its length, it is almost completely silent. No frequent moderate earthquakes. Cas rupturing the plate interface itself, no constant background rumble like you'd get at the Kermadec-Tonga Trench or off the coast of Japan. That silence isn't good news. It's the signature of a fault that's locked, meaning the two plates are stuck together, not sliding smoothly past each other, and instead building up strain that has nowhere to go until it eventually releases all at once. We know exactly how catastrophic that release can be, because Cascadia has done it before. On January 26, 1700, this entire boundary rupture in a single full-margin earthquake, estimated at around magnitude 9. We know the precise date because of an extraordinary piece of detective work. Written records from Japan describe an orphan tsunami, a large wave with no local earthquake to explain it, that arrived on the Japanese coast that same night. Match that against Pacific Northwest indigenous oral histories describing a violent shaking and a wave that destroyed villages along the coast. And scientists were able to pin the Cascadia rupture down to that specific evening. That's the last time this fault broke its full length. Sediment cores and buried marsh layers up and down the coast show a long history of similar events stretching back thousands of years, with full margin ruptures happening on average every 480 to 500 years, though the actual spacing between events varies quite a bit, sometimes a couple hundred years, sometimes closer to 1,000. Partial ruptures affecting just the southern segment, southern Oregon and northern California, appear to happen somewhat more frequently than that. And the sediment record shows evidence that not every past rupture broke tide, the entire margin in one go. Some events appear to have involved just the southern 2/3 of the fault, others the full length from California to British Columbia, which is itself an important reminder that the big one isn't necessarily a single uniform scenario. It's a range of possible rupture sizes and extents, and which version actually happens next is something nobody can currently forecast with precision. So when people hear that a moderate earthquake just hit near the northern part of the system, the instinct to sit up and pay attention makes complete sense. This is, without exaggeration, one of the highest consequence fault systems on the planet for the simple reason that it sits directly offshore from major population centers. Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, VR, Vancouver, all within range of shaking and tsunami impact from a full rupture. Modeling of a full margin Cascadia event generally points to shaking lasting several minutes, far longer than the shorter, sharper shaking most West Coast residents associate with a typical crustal earthquake, followed by a tsunami that could reach the outer coast within roughly 15 to 20 minutes of the rupture starting. That combination, unusually long shaking plus a short tsunami warning window, is exactly why this fault gets so much attention from emergency planners specifically, separate from the purely scientific interest in it. So let's actually dig into what a magnitude 5.6 near the northern end of this system does and doesn't tell us. The first thing to understand is that not every earthquake near Cascadia happens on Cascadia. This is the part that gets lost in most casual coverage of these events, and it's the single most important detail for correctly reading what just H happened. The locked megathrust interface itself, the part responsible for magnitude 9 events, rarely produces moderate earthquakes on its own. Instead, most of the felt seismicity in this region comes from nearby but mechanically distinct structures. The Juan de Fuca plate's own internal faults, crustal faults within the overriding North American plate, and especially around the northern end near Vancouver Island, a genuinely complicated tangle of smaller plates and transform boundaries, including the Explorer plate and the Nootka fault zone, where the Juan de Fuca and Explorer plates grind past each other. We have a really useful, well-documented precedent for exactly this kind of situation. Back in the summer of 2024, an area offshore Vancouver Island started producing a swarm of moderate earthquakes. It began with a string of magnitude 4 to 5 events, then a magnitude 5.7 large enough to be felt on the nearby mainland, and about a week later, a magnitude 6.4, the largest event in the sequence, releasing more than 11 times the energy of anything that came before it in that swarm. That's a genuinely significant amount of seismic activity concentrated in a small area over a short window. But when scientists went through the mechanics of IIT, the swarm wasn't occurring on the Cascadia megathrust itself. It was happening on that separate, lower hazard plate boundary system further offshore, the boundary tied to the small explorer plate rather than the main locked interface responsible, E4 magnitude 9 events. Because it happened 170 kilometers offshore in a low-density area, reported shaking on land stayed light even for the magnitude 6.4. The swarm ran its course and settled down without triggering anything on the main subduction interface. That precedent matters a lot here because the northern end of Cascadia is genuinely one of the most structurally complicated stretches of coastline in the entire region. Rather than a single clean plate boundary, it's a junction where the Juan de Fuca plate, the much smaller Explorer plate, and the North American plate all meet, connected by a system of transform faults, including the Nootka fault zone. This little wedge of crust behaves almost like its own small tectonic puzzle piece, independently accumulating and releasing stress in ways that are only loosely connected to the big, locked megathrust interface sitting just to the east of it. Earthquakes here tend to be more frequent, more varied in mechanism, and considerably less hazardous per event than anything that would happen if the main subduction interface itself let go. It's genuinely one of the B-usiest patches of seismicity along the entire Cascadia margin. And it has been for as long as instruments have been recording it, which is exactly why a moderate event in this specific corner of the map isn't automatically remarkable in the way it would be if it happened, say, directly beneath Portland. That's exactly the kind of pattern worth keeping in mind here. A magnitude 5.6 near the northern end of the system doesn't automatically mean the locked megathrust itself just moved. It's entirely possible, and honestly, the more statistically likely explanation, that this event occurred on one of these secondary structures, a crustal fault, an intraplate rupture within the subducting Juan de Fuca plate, or activity tied to that same tangle of smaller plate boundaries near Vancouver Island that produced the 2024 sequence. Until a detailed focal mechanism and depth analysis comes back, and that kind of analysis takes real time to do properly, we shouldn't assume this event happened directly on the fault interface that produces the magnitude 9 scenario everyone is worried about. Now, depth and mechanism matter enormously here, the same way they mattered when we looked at that Kermadec cluster earlier this year. A shallow rupture directly on the locked interface, especially one large enough to significantly redistribute stress, is a very different T-animal from a moderate event within the subducting slab itself, or from activity on a nearby crustal fault that isn't directly coupled to the megathrust's locked patch. Seismologists distinguish between these using the depth of the rupture, the orientation of the fault plane from the C-ice, focal mechanism, and the aftershock pattern that follows. None of that is something you or I can read off a headline number. It requires the kind of detailed analysis regional seismic networks do in the days following an event like this. So let's get to the actual question people are asking. Is this a foreshock to the big one? Here's the honest, uncomfortable answer. We don't actually have a clean historical data set to check that against, because the 1700 rupture happened before any seismic instruments existed anywhere in the world. Everything we know about that event comes from tsunami records in Japan and oral history along the Pacific coast, not from a seismograph that could tell us whether there was a run-up of moderate earthquakes in the weeks or months before it broke. That's fundamentally different from a place like Japan or Chile, where instrumentally reco occasionally, though not reliably, shown periods of elevated seismicity beforehand. Cascadia has never had a full margin rupture during the era of modern seismic monitoring, so there's no equivalent instrumental record to compare this current earthquake against. Anyone telling you with confidence that this is exactly what happened before the big one broke last time is saying more than the data actually supports, because we don't have the data to make that direct comparison in the first place. What we can say, based on studies of other subduction zones around the world, is that foreshock activity before major megathrust earthquakes is inconsistent at best. Some large events, including the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, were preceded by a period of increased seismicity in the days and weeks beforehand, activity that, in hindsight, looked like a foreshock sequence, including a magnitude 7.3 event 2 days before the main magnitude 9.0 rupture that, at the time, was simply logged as a large earthquake in its own right, rather than recognized as a precursor. It was only after the main shock that seismologists went back and reclassified that earlier event as part of a foreshock sequence. Other major megathrust ruptures showed no such pattern at all. and arrive with no detectable seismic warm-up whatsoever. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile, still the largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded at roughly magnitude 9.5, was preceded by some regional seismicity in the days before, but nothing that was recognized as unusual at the time, and plenty of other well-studied subduction ruptures around the Pacific have occurred with essentially no preceding signal at all. That inconsistency is exactly why foreshock identification only really works in hindsight after the big event has already happened, and scientists can look back and say, that earlier activity was foreshock activity. Before the fact, a moderate earthquake near a subduction zone is genuinely ambiguous. It might be background noise on a secondary structure. It might, in rare case, turn out in retrospect to have been part of a foreshock sequence. There is currently no reliable method to tell those two possibilities apart in real time with any real confidence, and that limitation isn't unique to Cascadia. It's a fundamental unresolved problem across earthquake science globally. That said, there's a different, more slow-moving process happening beneath Cascadia constantly, one that's actually far more diagnostic than any single moderate earthquake. And it's worth understanding because it's one of the genuinely fascinating things about this fault system. It's called episodic tremor, and SLIP, ETS for short. Deep beneath the locked portion of the megathrust, below where the fault sticks and stores strain, there's a transitional zone where the plate interface slips slowly and silently, over days or weeks, releasing strain gradually instead of violently. This slow slip is accompanied by a low-amplitude rumbling C, all-id tectonic tremor, which is picked up by sensitive seismic instruments, even though it's far too weak and slow to ever be felt by a person standing on the surface. In Cascadia specifically, these episodes recur on a strikingly regular cycle, roughly every 14 months beneath much of the northern part of the system, making it one of the most predictable slow slip cycles anywhere in the world, almost metronomic compared to how erratic and unpredictable regular earthquakes are. Each time one of these slow slip events happens, it actually transfers a small amount of additional stress onto the shallower, locked portion of the fault, the part response, Siebel for the big, damaging earthquakes. Scientists monitor this cycle closely with continuous GPS stations that measure the coastline, physically moving by fractions of a millimeter, along with borehole strain meters planted deep in the ground along the coast, because it's one of the only windows we have into how stress is low. Ding onto the locked patch over time. This is a completely different and far better instrumented signal than a single moderate earthquake showing up on a map, and it's the kind of data that actually informs serious hazard modeling for this region, rather than a single headline number that spikes public attention for a week and then fades. If you want a genuinely useful thing to watch instead of any one earthquake, this slow slip cycle is it, precisely because it's continuous, well instrumented, and directly tied to the mechanics of the locked interface itself, rather than to a secondary structure nearby. So where does that leave the actual, honest assessment of this magnitude 5.6? Based on everything we currently understand about how this system behaves, a single moderate earthquake near the end, northern end of Cascadia, on its own, without a confirmed rupture on the locked interface itself, without an unusual burst of episodic tremor and slip, and without a broader sequence building in the same location, does not meet the bar for the thaw. A big one is imminent. It's far more consistent with the kind of background seismicity this region produces regularly on its secondary fault structures, the same category of event as that 2024 Vancouver Island sequence, which ran its course without any connection to the main subduction interface. But, and this is the same caveat that applies every single time we talk about a fault like this, that doesn't mean the risk isn't real. It means the risk was never tied to this one earthquake in the first place. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is going to produce another full margin rupture even tually. Based on the average recurrence interval derived from thousands of years of sediment records, we are currently more than 3 centuries past the last event, comfortably within the range where another rupture becomes geologically plausible, even though the spacing between past events has been irregular enough that nobody can put a precise date on it. That RRR ISK exists on a random Tuesday with absolutely no preceding earthquake at all, the same as it exists this week with one. This particular magnitude, 5.6, doesn't meaningfully move that underlying probability up or down in any way current science can measure. What actually matters here, the same way it mattered when we discussed the Alpine Fault and Hikurangi Zone in New Zealand, is what this region does with that baseline, ever-present risk. And this is where things get genuinely concerning in a completely different way than a NGLA earthquake headline. The Pacific Northwest has known about the Cascadia hazard in its current, fully understood form only since the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the geologic detective work connecting the 1700 event to the orphan tsunami in the buried coastal marshes was finally pieced together. That's a strikey. Inkly short window of awareness for a region that had already been building cities, schools, hospitals, and bridges for well over a century beforehand, all without knowing this fault was capable of a magnitude 9 event. A huge amount of existing infrastructure, older schools, older bridges, older unreinforced masonry buildings throughout. Outgoat Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver was built before anyone designing them knew this fault existed in the form we understand it today. Retrofitting programs have made real progress since then, particularly for critical infrastructure like HEOS, PIDLs and emergency response buildings, and the Shake Alert early warning system, which uses a network of sensors to detect a rupture the instant it begins and push out an alert before the worst shaking arrives at more distant locations, now covers much of California, Oregon, and Washington. That system has already demonstrated real value in smaller earthquakes, giving people anywhere from a few seconds to, in some scenarios, over a minute of warning depending on their distance from the rupture. In low-lying coastal areas, the tsunami that would follow it. Coastal communities directly on the outer coast, places with only 15 to 20 minutes between the shaking starting and a tsunami arriving, face a genuinely difficult logistical problem, because that's not much time to move, people, especially anyone with mobility challenges, to higher ground. And some of these communities are still working through exactly how to solve that with limited resources. This is the layer of the story that rarely gets attention compared to a single dramatic earthquake headline, but it's arguably the part that actually determines how bad the eventual big one turns out to be for the people living through it. That's really the heart of why this earthquake deserves a serious conversation, rather than either dismissal or panic. Not because this specific magnitude 5.6 tells us the countdown has started, because on the evidence currently available it doesn't, but because talking about it is a chance to talk about the actual standing risk that exists in this region, independent of any single earthquake making headlines this week. The TBE remore and slip cycle beneath the locked zone keeps ticking along every 14 months, regardless of whether a moderate quake happens near Vancouver Island or not. The recurrence interval keeps accumulating regardless of today's headline. And the retrofitting gap in older buildings up and down the coast keeps existing regardless of whether this particular news cycle fades by next week. So, if you want the direct answer to the question in the title, is this a foreshock to the big one? Based on what we can actually verify right now, there's no confirmed evidence that this event ruptured the locked megathrust interface itself. No unusual signal in the deep tremor and slip cycle, and no historical instrumental record from Cascadia's last major rupture to compare this against in the first place. The far more likely explanation is that this happened on one of the secondary fault structures near the northern end of the system, the same category of activity we've seen before in this exact region, without it leading anywhere near a full margin rupture. That's not a guarantee about what happens next, because nobody can offer that guarantee. For this fault, full stop. It's simply the most accurate reading of the evidence currently in front of us, and it's worth repeating that this assessment could shift the moment new data comes in. If the depth and focal mechanism analysis comes back showing this event actually occurred directly on the shallow locked interface, that would meaningfully change the conversation. And I'll say so plainly if that turns out to be the case. Right now, though, that confirmation doesn't exist, and jumping ahead of the actual analysis to declare a foreshock sequence is exactly the kind of overreach that damages trust in science communication around earthquakes generally. It's also worth remembering that a magnitude 5.6 is, on its own, a moderate and survivable event almost anywhere it occurs on land with reasonable construction standards. The reason this particular earthquake is getting attention isn't the shaking it caused. It's the location, sitting at the edge. Rate from moderate earthquake happened nearby to the big one is starting, without doing the actual work of checking depth, mechanism, and whether this connects to anything happening on the locked interface itself. The real takeaway isn't about this one earthquake. It's that Cascadia's actual danger was never something that shows up conveniently on a seismic map a week before it happens. It's a slow, silent, centuries-long buildup that we can only track through GPS stations, tremor monitoring, and paleoseismic sediment records, and through any single moderate earthquake, however dramatic it looks when it lines up neatly with a scary headline. Watch the data, not the panic. I'll keep tracking this one and update you the moment the actual seismic analysis comes back with a depth and mechanism for this event, because that's the detail that will tell us far more than the magnitude number alone ever could.